So, as you know, you would hear a lot of conflicting claims about what the research says about domestic violence in the everyday line of your work. And that comes from people that are both coming from a nice, wanting to help place, and also from a place that's sometimes a little bit critical and not so nice. And one of the things that is inconvenient about domestic violence research is that you guys have a full-time job to do, and you don't have a lot of extra hours to kind of dig around, read all the journal articles that are coming out every week. And in fact, you probably can't do that unless you're affiliated with some sort of university, because all those journal articles are locked behind a password-protected wall in the library a lot of times. So one of the things that I like to try to do is to just give a little bit of translation about what's coming through, because you hear a lot of stuff and it's hard to tell what's really going on sometimes in that literature. So I'd like to ask you to think just for a moment about what some of the claims you hear in your everyday work about the research on sex differences in domestic violence. And you can just do that in your head. But if you can think of one that anybody would be willing to share, I'll repeat it for the microphone. Is there a claim that you hear in your everyday work about sex differences in domestic violence? Oh, it is just like teaching class. You're being shy.
There is no difference.
I have a contingency plan. Some of the common claims that people hear, here's two of them. So a couple of the common inaccurate claims about what the research shows on domestic violence are that women are as violent as men, or they are more violent than men. And another one that I kind of wanted to get in today, since I'm talking about the recent research, is this idea that all of the representative sample, or sometimes they get called community sample versus clinical sample studies, all those large-scale quantitative studies, sometimes people claim that all of those don't show any sex differences, and the only research that does show sex differences is like little tiny qualitative studies, or studies from refuges, or other places where women are specifically identified. So I'm going to address those claims a little bit today. So when we're talking about domestic violence statistics, I find it helpful to kind of keep a few questions in mind. Depending on where you work and the specific type of work that you do, statistics might have different uses for you, depending on your specific location. So whenever I'm thinking about domestic violence statistics, and in fact when I'm teaching a whole class on domestic violence, I really like to downplay the stats. I know that oftentimes students want to know the answer. So it's important to have statistics. We use them for a lot of practical reasons, but it's by no means the full picture of understanding violence in the place. So when we're thinking about domestic violence stats, I find it really helpful to ask, what do we want them for? Why do we want them? What are they used for? How are they useful to your work? And what can and can't they tell us? So that would really differ probably depending on what your specific job is. So when we think about what the research actually tells us, here's the summary version. You may think there's been a massive change in the research recently that's showing less sex differences than in the past. That's really not the case. The international and national research really still does show really marked sex differences in women and men's perpetration and experiences of violence. So both as targets of violence and also perpetrators, the experiences are still quite different. So although you hear more and more about this claims about sex symmetry, the research really hasn't changed that much. There's been kind of a multiplication of the same types of studies, but things haven't really changed that much. And then we also know that the sex differences increase as violence gets more serious. So in order to make claims about sex symmetry or gender equivalence or whatever you want to call it about domestic violence, you really have to ignore the vast majority of information that we have about this kind of social behavior. And here's a few of the things that you have to ignore is to say that women's and men's violence is the same. So you have to ignore all of this research, the homicide studies, the crime studies, the victimization studies, the official crime data, sexual assault, separation assault, animal abuse, stalking, injury, the context of what happened, and also batterer accounts and survivor accounts. So this is quite a lot of research to dismiss, right? As you know, the research literature on domestic violence has really grown rapidly over the past 40 years or so. So there's hundreds and hundreds of studies, maybe even thousands by now. And this is a lot of information to just kind of put aside and say, oh, there's one study that shows this, right? So this is something that I like to just remind us of. We have all of these sources of data and research about domestic violence. And when you're trying to understand what it looks like, you really do need to look at the whole picture. It's like if you're analyzing someone's situation and you want to set up a safety plan for the family, you really do need to look at their entire context, the history of the relationship, what's their living status, what resources, all of that stuff. So just like you do in everyday, all of the work that you do, we kind of want to do the same thing with the research. And as you know, looking at domestic violence is all about the context, right? One specific action can mean something totally different depending on the relationship that it's embedded in. So I just wanted to talk briefly today about a few of the really least controversial official data sources about domestic violence, because certainly you can go deeper than that. Certainly you can look at lots of other studies, but you don't even have to get a good idea about the sex differences in these types of violence. So when we look at the official sources that come from the government, these are kind of types of studies that are less easily dismissed as, you know, feminist craziness or something, or sometimes qualitative or small-scale studies get dismissed as if they're less valid than big quantitative studies. And that's okay, we can look at what the official data says. So intimate partner homicide. You have to completely ignore intimate partner homicide to make claims that domestic violence is the same for women and men. The dynamics are quite different. And the studies that people do refer to claim that women's and men's violence are the same are these kind of self-report questionnaire studies. Obviously, homicides are not included in that because deceased people cannot answer the phone and answer a survey. Although I wonder who actually does answer the phone and answer these surveys, because I know I screen my calls like crazy nowadays. So, but if we look at intimate partner homicide, I think this is a very important part of the research picture on domestic violence. Why is it important? It's one of the most objective measures of the most serious form of violence. And as you know from your work, homicide is quite rare in the spectrum of crimes, but the fear of being killed is pretty widespread when you're talking about serious domestic violence situations, whether it's articulated or in the back of your mind, in reference to yourself or your children. This is the thing that people are really afraid of. It's why we started having refuges in the first place, so that people would have a place to go, but also to be safe. So I think it's really important, though, to pay attention to homicide. Homicide is also more frequently reported than other crimes, just because it's more likely to be detected. All right. So anyway, intimate partner homicide statistics are less disputed than the other estimates, because with a homicide, there's a person who is deceased, right? And that's fairly easy to count. But that said, domestic violence homicides are still under-identified because there's not a uniform way to screen for them, right? Not all jurisdictions count them the same. They don't get identified as a domestic violence homicide all the time. So that said, pie charts are one of my favorite ways to talk about sex differences, because I think it's really obvious when there's a pie chart in your face. So if we look at all the different homicides that we had in Australia between 2008 and 2010, you can see that the different categories of homicides in Australia, they really vary quite a bit. And so in this pie chart, you can just see all the homicides that happened in Australia between 2008 and 2010. The biggest piece of the pie is acquaintance Perpetrated homicides, that's 37%. Other domestic homicides, which is not intimate partner but other family members or co-residents people, 34%. Unclassified is 13%, and stranger homicides are also 13%. Intimate partner homicide, the one up at the top there, is 23%. So if you look at the whole picture of all the homicides in Australia, intimate partner homicide makes up almost a quarter of those homicides. So it's a very serious crime. Sometimes when you hear people talking about sex differences and violence, they do it in ways that minimize the seriousness. But I think looking at the homicide numbers show this is a really big part of the crime problem in Australia. So if you look at all of the intimate partner homicide victims, break that down from that other pie piece by sex, you can see that male victims of intimate partner homicide make up a smaller piece of the pie than female victims. Women make up 73% of the intimate partner homicides. Okay, so intimate partner homicide makes up 23% of all the homicides in Australia, and of that, women are 73%. So the majority, obviously, there. And this is still quite a crude count. If you count all of what sometimes get called collateral killings, where other family members or children are killed, they can make even something like this, that is a, sorry to be crude, but a count of bodies by sex. That can be a little misleading as well, because if children are killed or other relatives or new partners are killed, you have more male victims than just the male intimate partner. So this again is an oversimplification, but it really does show this is not a symmetrical pie, right? The pieces aren't the same. If this was a chocolate pie and you got to pick the piece, which one would you choose? So then if we look at the sublethal violence, we don't have to stop at homicide when we're talking about sex differences. Another source of data we have besides the homicide data is the Australian Bureau of Statistics, their crime victimization surveys that get repeated periodically. So they collect data in a different way than some of the personal safety surveys do. So what you can do with these studies is look at the most recent assaults, and that can give you a picture of what these look like. Of the total number of most recent assaults of women from 2011 to 2012, fairly large piece of the pie there is an intimate partner offender. So for women, it's 32.3% of the most recent assaults were perpetrated by an intimate partner. Now for men, you can see that that piece of the pie is much smaller. It's only 6.4% for men. So you have 32% versus 6% sex difference there. So again, that's quite different. Sometimes when we're talking about sex differences in domestic violence, people want to talk about how there's more violent crime against men. Actually, those numbers aren't as different as you might think, but most of that violence against men is, of course, perpetrated by male offenders, but it's also not intimate partner violence. So if we want to look at the biggest safety concerns as far as prioritizing our services and crime responses and all of these things, you can see that men's biggest risk is from non-intimate partner offenders. And the largest category for men is for people that they know, acquaintances, but not family members or strangers. So this is a pretty marked, again, sex difference just from the crime victimization survey. So of course, a crime victimization survey is going to detect possibly more serious incidents than the personal safety survey, because people are identifying that as a crime. So I also wanted to talk a little bit about the prevalence rates. And prevalence just means people who have experienced intimate partner violence or abuse or not. So it's kind of a yes-no way of dividing things up. And if you've ever seen some of the questionnaires that get used to measure domestic violence, you know that those range from maybe less serious offenses to all the way up to attempted homicide. So oftentimes we use a tool called the conflict tactic scales that has incidents ranging from somebody threw something at you which I don't know about you, but my partner and I are really lazy. If we want to change a channel, we generally throw the remote at each other. Therefore, counting a certain way with that tool, we would both be perpetrators and victims of intimate partner violence. So that would be maybe on the mild scale, depending on what's being thrown, all the way down to beating up and strangulation are on that scale. So it's helpful sometimes to compare the prevalence rates for violence and abuse, but again, prevalence is, has this ever happened to you or never, which kind of levels out some of the differences. But we have some sources of data for that in Australia. At the top there, the top layer of this little table, we have the International Violence Against Women survey that was published in 2004, and that's a very large sample survey, 6,677 women above the age of 18. So the prevalence rate, the percentage of women that experience some form of intimate partner violence from mild to severe on the questions that they asked was about 4%. They also asked about lifetime prevalence of intimate partner violence, and that was way up at 34%. So that got quite high response rates for that study. The personal safety survey is one that often gets used here to talk about domestic violence victimization. So that one includes women and men. That's an even larger sample with over 17,000 respondents, women and men over the age of 15. And the past year prevalence of that is 0.6% for men and 1.6% for women. And then it jumps up to a lifetime prevalence of 5.3% or 16.9%. So again, we can both see there's a pretty big sex difference there, but you can also see that the response rates are much lower than the International Violence Against Women survey, and that's simply a function of the way that the survey gets introduced and also the fact that there's fewer questions, right? If you ask fewer questions, you're going to get less disclosure on your study. So just for the sake of comparison, I wanted to include a couple of other quite large-scale studies that are fairly recent. There's this one by Dal Grande and colleagues from 2003, and that was a population-based study or a representative sample conducted in South Australia that also had a big sample size, over 6,000 people. And so that found lifetime intimate partner prevalence rates of 12% for men and 23% for women. So that again was a phone survey, just like the other ones. So you can see these quite different rates from a fairly similar kind of research methodology, calling people up on the phone and asking them questions about their experiences, right? And so that got pretty high rates in between the other two, but that one also includes men for the sake of comparison. And then finally, there was another reasonably sized study by Hegarty and Bush, and that was here's a study that they did in Brisbane doctors' offices, and this was when they did a paper survey. It wasn't a representative kind of random sample the way that the Del Grande one was, but that also found pretty high response rates. But it was just a survey of women over the age of 16. And that one got a past year prevalence of 8% and a lifetime prevalence of 37%. Okay. So what this table shows you, I mean, there's all these white squares in there. The data that we have available easily to us in Australia is not fantastic for making these kind of sex-based comparisons. I haven't included the actual police data about crimes which show even greater sex differences, because those are a little bit easier to dig up. But these are really the top two, and the crime victimization survey, which is not comparable but also contains some good information. These are really the major sources of information. So what can we know from looking at a table like this? Well, we can know that there's some pretty big differences between from study to study, depending on how they're introduced to the people that are completing the study. We can know that there's some pretty big sex differences between women and men. But I think what this, a table like this can show us is that you can't just look at one single study if you want to make some claims about what the research says. Even with something as straightforward as prevalence rates, you really do have to look at the whole picture, right? And if you're going to say, oh, I'm only crediting the one with the lowest numbers, you have to have a really strong justification for doing that. I think all of these statistics are useful, but you can't look at any study in isolation without thinking about the rest of the research. So again, these are some large-scale, quantitative, totally objective, survey-based numbers that show really big sex differences. They also show that there are male victims of violence and abuse. So that's important to note as well, but that there still are big sex differences. This hasn't gone away over time, even though the conversation has kind of shifted in that direction. So given those statistics in this table and all these pie charts here that show quite different numbers for women and men for domestic violence, why do you think that people make these sex equivalence claims? And this is a question that I actually want you to answer. In your work, what does this look like for you when people say to you, aren't women as violent as men? Or do you hear that claim here? Because I'm not sure that environment that you guys are all working in.
I hear it more on like the internet and social media sort of things, where people are able to just go, oh, I've linked this website, so that means it's true.
I have that experience when I'm teaching. So for those of you who couldn't hear the microphone in the back, she said sometimes you come across these claims, people find them on the internet and they say, oh, I found a website that says it, so it must be true, right? Yep, so there are websites that make claims about sex symmetry. There's websites that make the opposite argument. Obviously, everything on the internet is not 100% true or accurate. So that is something that we have to be aware of. So there may be actually quite detailed websites that make claims and find all kinds of statistics that seem to show that women and men are similarly violent. But what those websites do is leave out all those other types of violence and abuse that were in the list that I put up before. And they also probably leave out a lot of data from even the studies that they're citing about the more serious types of violence, the levels of fear when that's asked about, the kind of resources people are seeking out. So there's a lot of data floating around that can be tricky to figure out. So why does it matter? Once we leave out all those other types of research on domestic violence, on stalking, on separation assault, on homicide, on animal abuse, on all of those forms of coercive and controlling behavior, we're not really talking about domestic violence the way that you probably think about it as somebody that does work supporting people that require some sort of assistance around this issue. The risks continue to be greatest to both children and partners, both male and female partners, from men, as with non-domestic violence crimes. And dealing with gendered factors is essential for prevention and intervention. And I found it really interesting in Australia, coming from Canada and the US, that there is quite a lot of press coverage of certain kinds of men's violence against other men. A lot of this drunken violence behavior gets a lot of coverage here with the king hits and all that. But we're not really talking about masculinity at all, and what the contributing factors to these problems that we really need to address if we want to prevent violence in the first instance instead of just reacting and putting people in jail. So I wanted to give you some tools that you can ask about domestic violence research, and Sandra Walkley put this really nicely in an article that was actually about counting or measuring sexual assault. She said, when we're going to study sexual assault, we have to think about what to count, how to count, who to count, and what's to be done on the basis of that counting. And I think for us, it's good to be mindful, especially of that fourth one. Statistics do have a place in our work. Most of us have to kind of produce some statistics when we're making appeals to funders to get money to continue services. You have to collect statistics about who's coming in and using your services. So maybe we can be pragmatic about collecting the most useful data that we need for the work that we do. So some practical questions that you can ask when somebody presents you with a study. I don't know about you, but people email me things all the time. Oh, so-and-so did this study that shows women are more violent than send me the study, or I'll get an email from a practitioner or professor that this is not their area, and they'll say, look, this guy sent me this study, what do you make of this study? And as somebody that looks at this junk all the time, all of these studies, I can look at it in 10 minutes and go, oh, well, this is what's going on. But that would not be normal for you because this is not what you guys do all day. You're doing your regular jobs. So some questions you can ask when somebody presents you with a study is, and this one's really obvious when you see their writing, what questions did they ask about domestic violence, right? The questions that they ask are really important. The questions can do a couple of things. They can minimize types of abusive behavior that are really central to domestic violence relationships. And they can also minimize differences that are really significant. So the second question you can ask when you come across a study is, are there any questions in this survey that ask about things that can help us actually understand what happened? Because just counting actions don't really go very far, even with the most serious types of domestic violence. You can count all your homicides, but that doesn't really give you much insight into what actually happened. And a surprising number of studies don't even bother to ask if the violence was defensive or retaliatory or an attack on someone else. So if you count that way and you don't ask about context, if someone's strangling you and you scratch them to get their hands off your neck, you're both perpetrators and victims equally. So it's important to look and see, have they included questions that can help you understand what happened, and those include a bunch of different items you can include there, but namely anything about the context. Was this self-defense? Was it an attack? Is it part of a pattern of violence that's ongoing? Was it a one-time thing? The meaning of the event, do they ask any questions about what it meant for either the perpetrator or the target of the violence? Were you frightened? Was there an outcome? Were you injured? You know, those kinds of questions about the meaning of what happened for both people. You can also ask questions about motives, which is another way of saying context. Was this defensive or offensive violence? And also including items about outcomes. Did you seek help? Did you feel like you were frightened? All of those items. So those are pretty simple to ask those questions, but that's something that you can look for in any survey to see if that stuff's been included. The third thing to think about was, how was the data collected? And this is something that I think about more and more now that everybody has cell phones, or mobile phones, I should call them here. Hardly anyone has landlines in their homes anymore, and a lot of these types of survey-based research, and depending on where you live, there can even be regulations that you're not allowed to make research or marketing calls to mobile phones because of the ways that billing sometimes works. So thinking about how the data was collected, telephone surveys to landlines are still considered to be a valid method of research. But increasingly, those are reaching a smaller and smaller pool, and perhaps an aging population that those studies are reaching. Generally speaking, surveys that are conducted in person, where there's a paper and pencil questionnaire, tend to get higher rates of response, so that's something else to think about. And this is something that even me, like when I get a phone call at home, I still have a landline because of how my internet works. But if somebody called me up and started asking sensitive questions about my relationship and experiences of violence, you don't know who's on the other end of that phone call. If you're still in an abusive relationship, how many of you have known survivors of violence and abuse whose partners called them to check up, right? And see what they're saying, see who they'll talk to. So especially if you're still in a relationship where there's abuse going on, I think the likelihood of answering those questionnaires is pretty low. So you can look at how the data was collected. Another huge question is who was left out. The numbers that I put up there, the homicide, like I said, the homicide numbers are pretty comprehensive. But for the other major surveys in Australia, a lot of rural areas are really underrepresented, and that means that a lot of Aboriginal communities are left out as well, just because they end up with small sample sizes and they can't do statistics well with those numbers of people. And since the dynamics of domestic and family violence are different in different communities, that can skew the reality of the picture. So it's important to look at who was left out. And then another question that you can ask is, how does this particular study that I'm being presented with relate to the rest of the research on domestic violence? One study doesn't cancel out the other hundreds of studies that have already been done. But I think something that we forget to think about is it also needs to relate to other types of violence. If you look at violence in general and abusive behavior, what does that look like outside of that particular couple or family out in the community? That can differ pretty widely based on where you are and the types of violence that you're talking about. So finally, I think the most important question to kind of keep in mind for us and people that are interested in serving survivors of violence, preventing violence, and effectively intervening in violence is to think about how or if we can use this data to better prevent or intervene in violence. Counting acts isn't so useful for thinking about what can we change to make this type of violence less common. And I think this is a really important one to keep in mind because we can get distracted if people are sending you stuff to dispute the work that you do or how you're going about your work. You can get distracted and spend a lot of time kind of responding to those claims and getting distracted from your core work, which is this study useful to helping us understand violence in order to prevent it, which is really the thing we should be focusing on. And surprisingly, there's a lot of research that isn't really focused on that. You know, there's people that are all into statistics or they got a grant or whatever, and so they'll do studies that aren't necessarily designed around thinking about prevention. So, two final things to remember. All sources of data is political, which just means it has implications for power relationships, what we choose about what to study, how to study it, and what to do with the findings are shaped by life and the world that we live in, right? So all data is political. Sometimes you'll hear people say, oh, this researcher has politicized the issue of domestic violence. Well, it was already political. It's political that we even talk about it at all. So don't take the bait about that. And then finally, data, even a really good survey or interview in-depth study can't solve ideological debates about the nature of human society and behavior. So sorry about that. Data cannot solve those ideological differences, and it doesn't have to, right? It's okay for people to disagree and argue, but you can't hide behind the data and say, my data is the truth with a capital T, and therefore your position can be dismissed. These are ideological debates about the nature of society and human behavior. And that's okay. It doesn't have to be resolved necessarily. So I put in some of the references that I used in the table, but that's it. So we have time for some questions. Hopefully someone out there in the links can hear us. And we have people here too. Are there any questions or anything that you'd like to talk about in the remaining few minutes that we have?
Molly, obviously you're only talking about domestic violence as a crime under the criminal code. I wonder how that data would look if we included the other factors that are part of the Domestic Violence Protection Act.
Yeah, so the stats that I provided you aren't solely based on the criminal code, but a lot of them are homicide, obviously. That's a crime. And then the crime victimization study, obviously, is asking about crimes. And in fact, the statistics that I put up were only for physical and sexual assault. So some of those surveys ask about a whole other range of economic abuse, psychological abuse, controlling behaviors. And that's where you really see a lot of stuff that helps you understand the dynamics of violence coming out. So, you know, what that does, if you look at all of that extra kind of data that's not just based on the physical assaults and physical and sexual violence, is that you see that a a larger number of women and men have experienced other forms of violence or abuse that are non-physical violent forms. So when you look at the very lower end of that spectrum, you have a closer to equal sex ratio. So if you ask men and women, has anyone ever told you something mean like you were stupid to make you feel bad? And you ask that of women and men, lots of women and men would say yes. But then you go up to the more serious part and talk about controlling and monitoring behaviors, and the sex ratio gets really different again. So that's a great question, including all of that other data, which is really the stuff we need to look at for prevention. The center has a wonderful report that Heather wrote that includes a lot of those questions. And really that's the case. On the lower end of the spectrum that's less serious, it becomes closer to an equal sex ratio. And then as you get more serious, the gap gets larger and larger. Yeah.
In those research studies and stuff, the ones that you cited, how do you know that the men and women who are responding are both, they're both have the same understanding of what constitutes different types of violence? Because a woman might say, yeah, he hit me, blah, 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 but a man won't consider it abuse in some cases.
Yep, that's a great question. The answer is we do not know the differences, and this is one of the problems. People often act as though survey or quantitative research is the gold standard for evidence-based research, right? But there's a lot of problems with questionnaire-based studies, and one of the things I always do with trainings, if I have more time, is I would have you guys fill out the conflict tactic scales. And every single one of those items, I guarantee you, every one of us would be saying, well, this could be yes if I think of it like this, but it could also be no, right? Just like when you took multiple choice exams when you were a little kid in school. Well, if you think of it this way, it could be A, but if you think of it the other way, it could be B. So we really don't know about how people are conceptualizing a lot of these ideas. With those studies that I put up, the homicide studies aside, but the victimization surveys, those are questions about specific acts. So it doesn't really tell you how they think about them unless you look at the additional questions that are in some studies and not other studies to help you understand that. So yes, you can have somebody that has done something to you that you may not consider to be a crime, but we really don't know how that plays out in the research. And in fact, we don't know the direction of the sex differences, if there are any systematic ones in that. We just don't know that. I'll put a question to you, because I kind of rushed over it at the beginning because I wasn't sure how long my 40 minutes would actually be. Do you guys hear discussions about this in your work, especially the remote sites? Do you hear people making claims about women's and men's violence? Is this something that you're even dealing with here, or is this something the Americans? Yeah. Or do you use these kinds of claims in the work that you do? Or is this something that the Americans are obsessed with, but the Australians are over it? There's some things like that.
I'm in uni, but socially, in my town, there's a lot, like I've even had a lot of friends that have been in domestic violence situations, and socially, everyone's response to it is, oh yeah, he did this, blah, 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 but she's just as bad. They say she does it just as bad as he does.
Yeah, that's kind of an indirect way of making that claim about, sometimes people describe domestic violence as being mutual or reciprocal, and I think that's kind of profoundly misleading, where if somebody's abusing you and you punch them back, that it's reciprocal. Because you think about reciprocal, it really means kind of equal force on both sides. And that really becomes very inaccurate when you talk about fighting back, which most people do.
People like to think they're karma, and they get to punish them for what they've done, and it's justifiable.
Yeah, so this is one of the kind of, I don't know, it's not really subtle, but slightly more subtle than saying women are as violent as men, as saying, yeah, she gives as good as she gets, or it takes two to tango, or, you know, he was just defending himself. I mean, often you'll hear batterers say, oh yes, she hurt my feelings, so I'm not good with my words, so I had to fight back with my fists, which is something that a lot of guys actually say. And they wouldn't say that if they didn't expect somebody in the hearing audience to kind of go along with that. So I think this is an issue that we see. And it can be really tricky, can make kind of a hostile environment for survivors who are trying to report violence and abuse, to get that kind of victim blaming coming at them from, in kind of a casual way, from a lot of directions.
I have one more question. How does the lesbian and gay community come into that research?
This is a tricky question. When you're just talking about numbers, those large-scale survey studies, often gay and lesbian individuals are such small numbers of the sample that it's difficult to do good stats. So in order to do a good study to really understand what's happening with domestic violence in same-sex relationships or couples where there's a transgender individual, the qualitative research is often your best bet, or the research with people who have presented to a service provider or something for some sort of assistance. And that's just mathematically. If you look at the statistics that get collected in Australia, even with those 6,000 person, it sounds like a big sample, but they don't even divide up a lot of the data by state because there's not enough numbers and there's not that many states, right? So the numbers just really fall down really quickly when you're talking about same-sex violence and abuse. And again, just like people are likely to be really kind of hesitant to share details about an abusive or violent relationship on the phone, a lot of people aren't going to be interested in outing themselves to a stranger on the phone. You don't know who's on the other end of that line. So these big survey studies aren't really great for that. And I would say that there are a lot of smaller scale studies of same-sex violence and abuse. They really have differing findings. And so I think a lot of people make claims about those studies and say, oh, it's just as prevalent, or men's relationships are more abusive. But I really don't think you can comfortably make those claims with the data that's available. I think we really don't know yet, and that's just because it's a smaller population, more difficult to access for research.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Molly. That was a really interesting presentation, and I think you've given people really some very good tools to help evaluate research and research outcomes and the claims that are being made in research. And I think that's really valuable for students and for practitioners working in the field, and also for staff at the centre. So, you know, I really appreciate you making the time to be here and to prepare that presentation for us. And I think that, you know, I'm sure people around the state will agree that it's been a very helpful introduction to the way in which we might need to better understand what's behind the research, not just what the research is saying, and putting it in that bigger context. So thank you very much. Please join me in thanking Molly very much for that presentation.